My dad called an emergency family meeting and said 2 people in this room have a crush on the same man, and one of them is my mom. I was at the gym when the family group chat went off, and my dad's message just said emergency get here now, no explanation. So I dropped everything, drove over and walked into the living room where my husband Daniel was already sitting next to my mom and my aunt, and my dad's side of the family, all crammed onto the sofa, looking at each other like nobody knew what they were about to be told. My dad stood at the front of the room, and I've never seen him look so calm, which was somehow the most unsettling part of the whole thing. And he said 2 women in this room have a crush on Daniel. I looked at Daniel and Daniel looked at me and I said, "Dad, what?" And he held up his hand and actually rolled a whiteboard in from the hallway, like he had prepared for this, and wrote Daniel's name at the top, and then drew 2 lines and wrote my name on one and my mother's name on the other, and just stood there holding the marker. And my mother went the color of a stop sign and said, "How did you find out?" And I want to be very clear that she did not say, "That's insane," or "What are you talking about?" She said, "How did you find out?" And my stomach just dropped completely. And my dad's voice stayed calm, and he said, "I can tell by the way you look at him. You haven't looked at me like that in 25 years. And the room was so quiet I could hear the television in the next room. And then my aunt cleared her throat and said, "Okay, well I also think Daniel is quite attractive." And I turned to look at her so fast my neck hurt, and she put her hands up and said, "It's not a big deal. He's just a good man. He helps people. He actually listens." And I grabbed Daniel's hand and said, "We are leaving right now," and started walking toward the door. And Daniel didn't move. He gently pulled his hand back and said, "Wait." And the look on his face stopped me completely, because it wasn't the face of someone who was surprised. He stood up and walked to the front of the room and said, "I already knew." And I said, "You what?" And he said, "It's not like they hide it. Your mom brings flowers every time she visits when she's had wine. She tells me I remind her of who your dad used to be. Your aunt texts me asking for help with things that don't need help." And I felt the floor shift under me and I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And he said, "Because their husbands treat them like furniture, and I wanted them to see that decent men still exist. That's all it is." And the room went completely silent, and I looked at my dad, and my dad looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked directly at my dad and said, "I've watched you speak to her, like she's an inconvenience in front of other people for years." And my dad opened his mouth and closed it again, and my aunt's husband stood up, and my dad said, "Well, this is exactly why I kissed my coworker at the Christmas party." And my mom stood up and the whole room just ignited, and Daniel walked over to me very quietly, put his hand on my back and said, "Do you want to leave now?" And I said yes. And we walked out the front door and sat in the car in the driveway for a while without saying anything, and he reached over and held my hand, and I didn't know whether to cry or laugh or call my therapist, so I did none of those things. I just sat there, and after a few minutes he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I genuinely don't know." And he nodded, like that was the right answer. My mom texted me 3 days later, like nothing happened, asking if I wanted to come for Sunday dinner. I left it on red. My aunt called twice. I didn't pick up. Daniel made pasta that night, and we watched something forgettable on the sofa. And at some point I looked at him and thought about what he said in that room, and felt something I don't have a clean word for. The family group chat has been very quiet since Tuesday.